just try and respond to some of the things that have already been said. I think that in trying to develop a post-liberal politics, Adrian and I are trying to call attention to the deficiencies of liberalism rather than to completely dismiss it, so that one could say that our politics tend to be dominated by trying to maximize freedom and freedom of choice, and trying to find ways of coordinating different choices, whether through the market or through bureaucracy. And that's also often combined with a generally utilitarian attitude of trying to make things function as well as they can, so that the two primary values that have overwhelmingly derived from an Anglo-Saxon world seem to be freedom on the one hand and utility on the other. And I think that Adrian and I are trying to say that that's all very well, you know, we're not going to agree about everything, and things do have to function efficiently, but it's simply not enough. And I think it's incredibly striking that the most liberal countries in the world, which arguably are the United States and the United Kingdom, are the two countries that have really managed the coronavirus crisis worse of all. You know, the fact that they don't have a very strong sense of community, they don't have very much subsidiarity, that they've kind of minimized a sense of the common good and working together, has fared incredibly badly during you know, the current crisis. And to us, it poses real questions about what you might call the Anglo-Saxon way, and suggests that it really needs modifying. I think another thing that we think is that political theory is dishonest about political practice, that in reality, we do have to have some sort of notions of the common good. It's not enough simply to agree to differ or to agree only about functional things, that we do have to share priorities. Otherwise, you know, we wouldn't agree about how our villages should look or whether we should have public libraries and so forth. But to some degree, we do have a sense of what the priorities are, and we do have some sense of which virtues should be encouraged if we're going to have a genuine political society. But we need to be much more honest about that, and we need to return, if you like, to modern versions of classical and medieval notions that part of the purpose of politics is educative. It is to try to produce good citizens, flourishing people living satisfying lives, and it's only those kind of people cooperating who are going to produce a good society. So obviously, you know, what the common good is, what virtues we should encourage is a matter of ongoing debate. You know, it was a matter of ongoing debate for Plato and Aristotle, for example. It's a matter of ongoing debate in the Hebrew scriptures. But unless you allow that politics has to be about that ongoing debate, I think eventually you produce a world of kind of anarchy, a world in which you know, the idea that you can pursue your own goals freely within the law quickly degenerates to trying to abuse the law or simply break the law, and the line between legality and criminality gets endlessly frayed. And I think we're seeing that you know, throughout the world at the moment. So I think in relation to, you know, conflicts like that between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and between different groups within Israel, we have to start by saying we don't really disagree about everything. You know, it's just not true. We're going to have to find areas where we agree to differ and where people pursue slightly different goals. But we need to focus on things that we can recognize in common, that virtues that we can recognize in common. It's as much a lie to say that traditions are totally different as to say they are totally the same. And instead of this pure liberalism of saying, well, we just agree to differ and we follow the same rules, I think coexistence involves more identifying concrete areas of overlap and concrete areas where we can collaborate. You mentioned another, area of tension, like do we put the land first or do we put people first? And you could generalize that also to something like our ecological crisis. And I would say that, we need to develop today a more kind of naturalistic humanism, more situated humanism. We need, I think, if we're following the traditions of Judaism or of Islam or Christianity, to see that, that the human comes first, but human beings are not isolated from their natural context. If you want to think religiously, they're not isolated from, the rest of the divine creation. And human beings can't flourish, as I think social scientists have now shown. They can't flourish in ruined, ugly environments. It affects profoundly their behavior. And we need not only good ecology, but we need to have emotional attachments to places. And again, we need to recognize where we can all feel a common attachment to places, and where also we need certain, if you like, enclaves, where we have special sacral attachments to different places, and we can live alongside each other. And remember that, in sort of pre-modern, sort of pre-liberal, ancient India, for example, what one did have the examples of those sort of complex plural coexistences and overlapping, and in the Near East itself, it's tragic that these interreligious conflicts seem, if anything, to be sort of increased, I think, within modernity. So I think we want not simply, totally isolated traditions, nor simply a totally neutral secular discourse, but a real identification of where traditions can overlap and learn from each other. And in that sense, we need a kind of postmodern, a post-liberal recuperation of a certain kind of shared ancient wisdom. And I don't think this is reactionary. I think it's an attempt to answer the evident extreme crisis of liberal capitalism, which the COVID pandemic is bringing to the fore.
I think that idea that that politics should be about values resonates very much with all of our groups and our participants and everyone here. On a practical level, how do we get there?
Yeah,
well, maybe Adrian can come in here.
Yeah, and I think that is really one of the key questions. And perhaps it is worth going back very briefly to the point about values and virtues, because, as has already been said, I mean, there are rival values and even incommensurable values. So the question then is, are we really just going to try and find a list of values on which we agree? But that seems not necessarily the best path, because even things like democracy and human rights are so deeply contested within countries, across countries, that I'm not sure that that is necessarily the best route, though we don't want to therefore, abandon all talk of values and simply shift away. But I do think it's important also to bring into the conversation interests. And interests are both material and symbolic, right? So, home is both your, your shelter, but also provides you with some emotional stability. Work gives you income, but also provides you with self-esteem and dignity. And so, the realm of interest is not a realm that we should dismiss. It is not just a realm of Machiavelli and Hobbes, in the sense of a kind of debased realism where you just fight for power and domination. It is also the realm of reconciling estranged interests and trying to bring them into proper collaborative, cooperative ties. So capital and labor, they too often posited as diametrically opposed. And yet, of course, you can't have flourishing workers or productive businesses without some cooperation and trust within them. So, you need to then think, what are the interests on which you can agree? What are the interests that you can negotiate in firms, in families and communities, but also at the level of the state, or indeed between nations? So I think interest is part of this, it's not just values. And I think virtues are crucial here because they are much more embedded in institutions and relationships and much more embodied than perhaps abstract values. So rather than us having endless debates about what is democracy or what is freedom, let's take it back to, lived practices. How can people build common lives, lives of decency and dignity where they live, in their neighborhood, in their locality, in their communities and further afield. And so rather than us staying at the level of abstract values, which are endlessly separated from facts, it's the old Weberian separation that really doesn't work. Virtues, give you a sense that this is actually all about the everyday existence, and that you try and negotiate where you are. Yeah. But I think practically it also means that government cannot be neutral, that the market isn't a neutral sphere. This is a complete fallacy. The state can try and be impartial, and often has to be impartial, so that it allows for interests to negotiate and to come together and cooperate. But there's no such thing as neutrality. So therefore, the state in the end has a choice between, what sort of goods it does promote. And this is where the state should try and have a sense of being the keep of the common good, opening up the spaces where people can work together, also promoting goods like education and health, and good housing and so on. So it can't be neutrality. There has to be something that is substantive. And I suppose that's where John and I have some reservations with elements of deliberative democracy a la Habermas, where, it's always the case that the state is somehow seen as neutral. It can filter out all the substantive content and just kind of leave it to rules or some sort of, secular consensus. That's not going to work. So therefore, we need to actually be fully plural, fully corporatist, allow groups and intermediary institutions a much greater say, but not somehow demonize state and market institutions. They're vital, but they have to be re-embedded in institutions and relationships so they can actually serve the common good and not serve the sectional interests.
So if I can push you both on this point a little bit, I think I'm an anthropologist, and I'm working with these groups and seeing the ways that they're doing kind of grassroots experiments in this kind of post-liberal projects, seeing how they can reformulate and think about new models, new ideas, new ways to do democracy that is not necessarily through the liberal grammar. And it's really amazing to see how much their critiques and their frustrations resonate with what you both write. It's actually quite remarkable. One of their challenges is moving forward from there. The diagnosis, they're right with you. Like moving forward to make something practical has become a real challenge, because of course one of the appeals, false appeals, yes, of liberalism was this kind of universal platform, this kind of, it's for everybody. And one of course, this turns out to be a false promise. And one of the challenges is producing an alternative that has real content that people can really connect with and really feel attached to and really give meaning to their lives. And that this is inherently going to be particular and embedded both socially and with regard to their religious tradition and these things, and they want it to be. And in a pluralist, first of all, that by itself is a big challenge. I've sat with groups of religious Zionists who are like, okay, so on these issues, let's come up with an alternative. Let's think about our own tradition and our own values and think about how we can articulate a political alternative. And it's extremely challenging because they see a religious tradition that doesn't necessarily have a very clear political counterpart. And trying to translate these ideas and values into a political idea has become a real challenge. And also running up against challenges that even if they succeed in doing that, it's just an extremely heterogeneous society. And thinking about how there's going to be these big differences, and there is not going to be this neutral state and this neutral platform. Negotiating that in such a diverse and plural society is obviously a major challenge. And I do understand that within this question, I've asked you to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But maybe you can just talk in that direction. I understand that is the question, right? I'm sorry, I had to.
I mean, just briefly, perhaps on that. I mean, I do think that what's remarkable and very worrying is that some really important notions and practices like democracy and citizenship have really been devalued so much by different traditions and ideologies, to the point where really citizenship nowadays is little more than a passport and maybe sort of, occasional voting. And democracy, again, is mostly about sort of the electoral cycle and it's really dangerous because these are incredibly precious goods. They're also very fragile. So how do you rebuild thicker and more meaningful notions of citizenship and democracy? And I think that's one of the key things. And citizenship and democracy are one way to bring people together from very different traditions, because that is a good that they can hold in common and everyone can make a distinct contribution to that. So you need deliberation, you need debate, but you also need forms of decision-making. So, one of the things that John and I have always been very interested in is how do we supplement representation with kind of a more associative form of democracy. So democracy that's about intermediary institutions and groups, right? Professions, faith communities, and other groups coming together. Whether that takes the form of a citizen assembly or not, I think that's sort of a secondary, though important question. But it's to try and inject participation and association into democracy. Not say democracy is just about the individual on the one hand and the collective on the other. That's not enough. Democracy needs to be much more plural. Again, corporatism is really vital here. And for citizenship, it's the same thing. It can't just be a formalistic thing about rights and entitlements. There has to be a thick sense of mutual obligation. So if I'm a citizen of a country, it's not just that I'm entitled to all sorts of things, though that's true up to a point. The question that we have to ask is, what are my obligations to my fellow citizens? Also, what are my obligations to residents who aren't yet citizens? What are my obligations to strangers in our midst, maybe immigrants who've only just recently joined? And that question of mutual obligation is almost absent from the political discourse. And it's been very, very corrosive, because with that comes a lack of trust in political institutions, comes a lack of participation. People no longer want to go into politics or even vote because they're so disillusioned. So, we really need to rebuild democracy and citizenship from the bottom up by making it meaningful to people where they are. If we don't, we would very quickly either, slide into anarchy, as John has said, or often on the back of anarchy comes extreme coercion. And neither, will give us a meaningful, dignified life.
I mean, I suppose you could argue, Adrian, that we're questioning the entire professionalization of politics that is part of the modern era, that the political function is alienated towards the state, and it's separated from the economic function. And that's supposed to be privatized, that the only way in which you could develop a more genuine participatory democracy is if we recovered the sense that by being involved in social community life, by being involved in doing your job, you are part of politics. That belongs to citizenship. I mean, it's really startling to read in a very well recognized book about the Middle Ages that in England in the Middle Ages, 1 in 10 people held some sort of public office.
Wow.
So are we more democratic than the Middle Ages? You could question that, it seems to me, in a serious way, despite the fact that this was so much more hierarchical a society. People were public roles were far more distributed than they are today. and therefore, you know, we need to recover a sense that every economic institution is making a social and political difference, you know, and therefore it has to exercise social and political responsibility. And I think this is part of what you mean by revisiting notions of corporatism that are regarded as often seen as very discredited. But I'm not so convinced. I think unless we get rid of that division between the economic and the political, and unless we get rid of the sense that politics is a technical, administrative business, and which means really sort of recovering a more ancient sense of distributed citizenship, linked to a more democratic sense of what the virtues are than for the ancients. You know, that if virtues are things like love and patience and pursuing peace and forgiveness, then everybody can pursue those. You don't have to be a noble to pursue those virtues. And I think that is part of the biblical and indeed, you know, probably the Quranic legacy, that to go in that direction of a democratizing of virtue. Whereas what we have in modernity is, instead of that kind of religious legacy of democratizing virtue, various simulacra of kind of pagan virtue on the one hand, or a kind of abandonment of virtue altogether in favor of a much more sort of formalistic kind of society. So I suppose we are arguing for a rather big sort of transformation, but then I think we're in a very, very big crisis, and I think there's mounting evidence for that.
So
go ahead.
Go ahead, Erica, it's fine.
Oh, I just wanted to ask, just as a follow-up, if there are some associations, either religious associations or other types of not necessarily political organizations, that you feel maybe are closer to this kind of a model that you imagine being a more that the state could adopt. I'm thinking in my head about the ultra-Orthodox society and how embedded it is, and really how many people there have public roles, and really just maybe expanding this kind of thing to a much broader governmental.
I think that's right. That we need to look at those conservative groups, or at, you know, the sort of things like the Mennonites in America, or you know, probably certain sort of Shiite groups, and you know, instead of it all being confrontational, talk about what in general we can learn from such groups, you know.
Yeah.
So in a way, press against their sectarianism, but also see how there are so many enormous values to be learned. I mean, I've just been watching the exciting dramatization of A Suitable Boy, which is an Indian novel on British television, and incredibly struck by the sheer strength of sort of Indian family life, and the way, while on the one hand it can be oppressive, that it's way more convivial than anything that we have nowadays. And it's in this way that I think we need to question some of these left-right divisions. You know, that we have the right defending a sort of bourgeois family, we have the left attacking any kind of family. We need to think about, say, the radicalism of a rich family life as a rich community life. And this, again, although religions can be oppressive, it's this sense of an all-round concern. You know, so often tolerance just means indifference, you know, a kind of cold indifference. And I think we've somehow got the balance wrong, you know, that we're you know, I mean, England is peculiarly extreme, that everybody, leaving everybody alone is regarded as the ultimate value. And it you know, it does mean an extreme tolerance of eccentricity, but we take it far too far. And nowadays it means mounting mental crisis, basically, you know.
In your book, you mentioned the need for both political leadership that understands this and takes the lead in educating, and the associative democracy where citizens are participating and also taking their own responsibility and obligations. I don't think one of the things that is an integral part of each of our groups that we're working with is also the media. And it seems to me that the role of the media, or the reality of today's media and today's politics, is working against us because it doesn't seem conducive to allowing a conversation or a deliberation of these competing values that we need, as you rightly say, need to have at the forefront.
I mean,
how on a very practical level do you recommend that we are able to get beyond the sound bites and the polarization that today's politics and media seem to be forcing upon us, so that we can have these conversations about values important to all groups, and that may be even contradictory, but at least having that deliberation and conversation?
Adrian, do you want to say something?
Again, it's a really vital question, and certainly in the US and the UK, where I think the media really is so instrumental to what's going on in politics and in society. I mean, there's some very practical things one could do. I mean, first of all, there is a sort of high concentration of the private media that is, I think, very dangerous, almost tending towards a kind of oligopoly. And I think just, pluralizing ownership is really important here, because I think with a more plural ownership come a greater genuine diversity of voices and traditions. So I think ownership is one thing to look at. Another thing to look at is, like in politics, but the same goes for the media and for other more professionalized sectors today, is how people are recruited. And at the moment, we've got a sort of terrible, bias either way. So you either have kind of extremely, sort of ultra liberal voices at one end of the spectrum, who think that everyone else is reactionary and should be silenced, or else you've got really reactionary voices who think that everyone else who's a progressive is evil, and these demonize each other and fuel each other all the time. And you see this in America between the mainstream media and all the kind of insurgent media, and it creates a terrible atmosphere where no one can make any nuanced point whatsoever. You have to be partisan, you have to be a liberal or a conservative. And in fact, the really strange thing is that the media today is neither. It's not liberal in the best sense of generous, and it's not even conservative because it's not conserving anything. It's essentially kind of ultra progressive versus ultra reactionary, and it's really diminishing democracy in a terrible way. So pluralizing ownership, looking at the recruitment of media people, and how they have to reflect the whole of society, not just two extremes. And I think finally, I think politics has to take a much stronger lead. I think our politicians, generally speaking, and I don't mean individuals, I mean as a sort of class, are far too compliant, are far too fearful of the media. They have to lead by example, and they have to take a stand, and they have to take on powerful interests like the media and not be cowed into silence. So it does require much more virtuous political leadership. It has to be, about bringing many more voices into the media. And that means by breaking down, kind of barriers of ownership and barriers of ideology.
Yes, I think, I agree with all that Adrian has said. And I think we've now got a kind of reductio ad absurdum of liberalism, where there isn't any debate any longer. I mean, people like old-time liberals like John Gray have talked about this, that now liberalism simply means an assertion of the correct positions. And the correct positions are that you must recognize the self-determination of the individual and of a proliferating number of identities. And in a real sense, there is no longer anything to talk about. There's a new kind of religion or of identity politics, and often the language. The recent academic debates I've taken part in, I've been horrified by the way they're so emotive. That people simply sit there and express sentiments. They don't any longer make arguments, because all you're supposed to do is express sentiments in support of the right position. And this means, I think this is what you're hinting at, Adrian, there's a kind of collusion with the other reactionary side, where they are just sort of asserting emotionally identities that they see as threatened. You know, so there's a counter emotion going on there, and there is no debate, and so, you know, we need to restore dialectics in the real sense. We need to have. It's not that feeling is bad, but it needs to be something like kind of reflective, disciplined feeling, and attempts at a kind of common discernment. But I think that, you know, this relates to one of the things that is a paradoxical aspect of our book, is, you know, on the one hand, we're insisting that we need more popular participation in democracy, but we're also suggesting that one needs to recognize that you know, the search for truth is not strictly democratic. It's a precondition for democracy, that we are we're trying to discern the truth, and unless you give a role to people who are at every level in the business of searching for truth and give them a platform, you don't have genuine democratic debate. What you have is manipulation by journalism, by social media, that, you know, we have to more honestly recognize that there is, if you like, a more elite educative role, even if that operates at many different levels. And I think you see in Britain that the more the BBC has sort of denied its old, somewhat paternalistic educative role, the more, in fact, it's become more elitist in terms of a total dominance by this metropolitan kind of alt-liberal elites, and it's sort of eating into their objectivity, if you like. And I think we need to recover that sense that there is a role for education and a searching for truth that is, if you like, kind of meta-democratic. It's a precondition for the being democracy. But, you know, truth isn't simply something that people vote about. And it's a sort of recover in that sense. Our book is arguing for encouragement and dissemination of virtue, but it's also arguing for a greater sense that leadership is earned by virtue and wisdom, not simply by power and money and popularity and celebrity. I mean, the extent to which we're now dominated by celebrity, for example, is absolutely shocking. You know, who cares what various Hollywood actors think about anything? You know, we need to recover a sense of the role of the wise in our society, because, you know, after all, this is something common to all of humanity. It's something that, you know, African tribes know about, the role of the wise elders and so on. We need to get back to that, I think.
I think that your diagnosis of the BBC resonates really strongly. What I would say the New York Times is exactly the same phenomenon. Yeah. I was listening to their podcast the other day. I almost threw my cell phone out the window. It was so frustrating. They just reduced themselves. But I want to kind of follow that and ask about the way in which the crisis of liberalism has so often been framed in terms of a conservative reaction or a right-wing reaction. Certainly in the US it's framed that way, in Israel it's framed that way, in India it's often framed that way. You have blue labor, which, you know, is an exception. I wish that we had figured that out, but at least in our context, in Israel, in the US context, this is definitely framed in a right-left, liberalism is left, and the alternative and all critiques of liberalism are right. And I'm wondering if you have any insights into how that happened, as someone who's dedicated to, you know, wanting to alter a kind of leftist anti-liberalism.
Yeah, well, I'm there as well. If I'll say something briefly and let Adrian come in. Obviously, part of our book was trying to suggest that right versus left misframes things, and that we're actually totally dominated by liberalism. And we're not alone in saying this. You know, people like Michael Lind and lots of other people have said it as well, that in reality, we have an economic liberalism on the right, and we have a cultural liberalism on the left. And often these are much more fused than anybody has admitted. And right to this day, in fact, the left has embraced a rather neoliberal economics. And I would say even today, the focus on Black Lives Matter and so on, for all that it may be a good cause, I'm sure it is nonetheless a way of promoting a cause that is not controversial in terms of capitalism. Walmart is quite happy to increase the identity, the diversity of the people working for them. It allows you not to address these more problematic issues of capitalism and even of kind of ecological depredation. And so, very much what Adrian are talking about, and this is sometimes on the right, it's seen as red Toryism, on the left as blue Labourism, is something much more like a different combination of sort of economic radicalism with a, shall we say, a kind of moderate, flexible social conservatism. And our argument is that overwhelmingly, that's the kind of direction people want. It's the kind of thing that will pull people together. But the major question, which maybe Adrian can address, is, it seems to be impossible to get the vehicles for that. And instead of that, you get kind of populism, which drifts in a quasi-fascistic direction. And Adrian and I often have disagreements with our colleagues in Britain, whom we feel kind of can get tempted away from post-liberalism, more towards populism, if you like. Adrian, would you like to sort of comment?
Yes. Thank you very much. First of all, I think it's really, in many ways, tragic that we are now where we're at, because after the financial crisis, things could have already been very different. This was one of the biggest missed opportunities in the last, 2 or 3 decades, because all the problems with hyper-capitalism were on display then in the most extreme way. And yet the political response was so utterly feeble and to the point where basically most parties and most political leaders, unfortunately, just went back to default mode. A bit of, redistribution, a bit of fiscal stimulus or monetary stimulus for a while, but we basically go back to business as usual. It was really pathetic. But what was interesting is at that time, or in the wake of the financial crisis, we did see lots of forms of left populism, right? We had your Syrizas in Greece, your Podemos in Spain, you had Bernie Sanders, who was beginning to pick up support, so left populism happened. And yet what was interesting is that when it came into contact with voters, it practically never won anywhere, with some small exceptions. Yes, Syriza was in power for a while, but didn't really transform things very much. Yes, Podemos participated in the Spanish government, but, it didn't leave much of a trace. Right-wing populism was much more effective. It won elections, it ejected liberals, Trump did it, the Brexit referendum did it. You could argue the Indian Prime Minister Modi is in that mold, clearly the Brazilian leader, Jair Bolsonaro, so there's a number of sort of national populist leaders who have, won elections, sometimes even retained power. And we'll see what happens with Donald Trump and others. But the fact is, neither left nor right populism really are the answer, because often they are just very confused phenomena. So left populism gets one thing right, about capitalism, but it buys into extreme identity politics, and therefore it's not going to be, a force of balancing moderation that brings together communities. Not at all, just the opposite. And even on capitalism, you could argue it's far too statist in its response. So yes, it diagnoses, the crisis of neoliberal capitalism, but we've known that for 30 years. That's not really new. What it doesn't do is at all, pluralizing ownership, really, directing capital into productive activities. It's all far too centralized, and statist. And of course, I like the fact that people like Bernie Sanders are, committed to fighting climate change, which is one of the great challenges. But again, I don't think a kind of new Green Deal at the aggregate level is the right thing. You have to bind ecology to everyday economy and to people's daily lives. You can't just do it at the macro level. This is never going to to command proper popular sort of consent or support.
Yeah.
And so in the end, there is a big space still between ultraliberalism and sort of, what Michael Lind rightly calls demagogic populism, because both forms of populism, left and right, are demagogic. And the space is for kind of virtuous, politics of truth in the end, where you try and seek, some form of truth. And of course, that will be the work of centuries always, but that's the space. And I think post-liberalism only has a future if it avoids extreme liberalism and demagogic populism and finally charts a proper third way. But of course, we also know that historically third way politics has often failed. So the question for post-liberals is how to avoid the failure of third way politics.
Yeah, very difficult.
Yeah.
I think you're leaving us with an incredibly difficult and challenging question that does hit the nail on the head. I think especially with our traditional groups that we're working with here, who do recognize that there needs to be a different way and a politics of virtue, of character, where we can have open debate about the why. Why are we here? Why are we conducting politics at all? To live in a society together, and what's the purpose? And I think our groups understand that even on somehow on a gut level, if not even explicitly and overtly, and yet the challenge remains, as you both, I think, rightly point out, how do we take those steps to get there without it being a revolution that overturns everything to become demagogic and populist. I think with some of the questions you've raised and some of the ideas that you have provided, I hope that we'll be able to do it a little bit better and a little bit more effectively. So thank you from all of us for first of all, doing the heavy lifting and writing that you've done with these concepts, and for spending the time with us to share some of these ideas with us today.
It's a real pleasure.
Yeah, thank you very, very much. It's been absolutely fascinating. Thanks for the wonderful questions.
Really helpful for us as well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And
thank you very
we will
much.
send you a copy of the movie.
Okay, lovely.
Okay. Okay.
Coming to
The
us.
feature film.
And we'll be glad to have you here with us in our next round.
Yeah, I mean, I'm only sorry we couldn't do this for another 5 hours, because it's fascinating to just have all kinds of questions, but we're limited, unfortunately, to what we can.
We'll drag you both to Israel at one point.
Oh, no, I'd love to come back again. Yes.
I've never visited the Holy Land, and I would just love
it's wonderful. Yeah.
And of course, when I do, I really, hope we can meet and do this around a real table.
Absolutely, absolutely. We'll show you an amazing time.
Well, thank you very much.
Next year in Jerusalem. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Here in
Bye-bye.
Jerusalem.
Bye.